Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you join us today. We're just letting the numbers increase a bit and giving it a second or so before we start our webinar of the day. Wonderful. So my name is Marie Dahl. I work for the MHPSS Collaborative. I'm also the co-chair of the Child and Family MHPSS Thematic Group under the Interagency Standing Committee MHPSS Reference Group. It's my pleasure today to have you join and invite you to participate in our webinar under the Wednesday Webinars for Wellbeing series, which is a series that focuses on different issues for children and families living in crisis and conflict zones that has been put together by the IASC Child and Family Group. This particular webinar is the fourth one in the series. It focuses on advancing infant, child, and youth mental health and well-being in climate and ecological crisis. I have a number of esteemed speakers with me today, and we all represent our different organizations. They will be introduced as we go. And I also have my colleague Louise, who's going to be moderating the session of today. Louise is the Advocacy and Comms Advisor of the Collaborative, with a long-standing experience working in the field of mental health and psychosocial support on advocacy and communications. So it's so great to have you here, and over to you, Louise.
Thank you, Marie, and thanks for letting me moderate this webinar. I've been looking very much forward to it. So I've understood for a long time that the climate and ecological crisis poses a lot of problems for humanity and for our nature and for our way of life, but it's only in recent years, after having had the privilege to work with quite a lot of the people who are presenting here today, that I've also come to understand that of course the climate and ecological crisis affects our mental health and well-being, and especially for those who are most vulnerable. So I'm really excited about having 6 very knowledgeable presenters to give us different perspectives on how climate change and ecological crisis affect infant, child, and youth mental health and well-being, along with some thoughts about what we can do about it as a field. So our first 2 presenters will take us up in a carbon neutral helicopter to look at the impacts, drivers, and frameworks and enabling environments relating to infant, child, and youth MHPSS in the context of climate change and ecological crisis. And after that, we'll land and hear about 4 different examples of impacts and interventions across the life course. So first off, Dr. Jura Augustinavicius will set the scene on how climate crisis drives humanitarian needs and present us with a systematic understanding of exposure categories and pathways of impact. And then Dr. Zeynep Hijazi will outline how this issue fits into the frameworks we're working within, and also where the gaps may be possibly. So we have a very, very full program today, but we also want to encourage questions from the audience. So at the end of the session, we'll have 10-15 minutes for questions and answers. And in the bottom of your screen, you should have the opportunity to put questions into the Q&A box. Please do that as we go along. We won't be stopping for questions during the presentations, but we'll get around as many as possible towards the end. So without further ado, I will leave the word to Jura, and then after Jura, we will transition directly to Zeynep. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Louisa. I think we'll just go right into the presentation. Perfect. As Louisa mentioned, today I'll be providing a high-level introduction to some of the impacts of climate change and ecological crises on mental health and well-being, and I'll introduce some frameworks that have been developed to understand links between these constructs. I'm going to highlight within this very high-level overview the need and opportunity for improved understanding and action in this area among infants, children, and youth, and look forward to seeing how my colleagues build on that. So on this slide, what I'm showing is that the most recent assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, concluded that global warming of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded during the 21st century, unless deep reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. And here I'm showing a number of different scenarios with projections for average temperature change under very low to very high emission scenarios. As you can see here on the right, in the absence of serious climate change policy and action, we are currently on a trajectory to a 3 to 6 degrees Celsius rise in global average temperature by the end of the century. Next slide, please. Thank you. In parallel, humanitarian needs are increasing each year, and that's what I'm showing here on the left. And on the right, we can see that the number of extreme weather-related disasters are also increasing with climate change. Next slide, please. Climate variability and extremes have been identified as key contributors to increases in global hunger and severe food crises, water shortages, conflicts, and displacement. There's a large body of evidence demonstrating that extreme weather events are associated with increased risk of intimate partner violence, child and elder abuse, family violence, and other forms of gender-based and community violence. And child marriage is being used to cope with the social, financial, and infrastructure stresses caused by climate change and weather-related disasters. Climate change hazards impact infrastructure and disrupt available services, including health services, making it challenging for people and families with existing conditions to access care and essential medicines. Next slide, please. So the IPCC defines direct impacts on mental health as adverse mental health outcomes experienced after exposure to one of these 3 types of climate change exposures or sets of hazards. And I'll briefly go through these and provide some again, high-level examples. Extreme weather events like storms, floods, wildfires, and extreme heat have adverse impacts on mental health morbidity and mortality and well-being. Extreme weather events have been associated with higher levels of mental health symptoms, disorders, suicides, and mental health-related hospital admissions, including among children and adolescents. This said, it is important to emphasize here that most people who experience some form of distress after disaster can effectively cope once basic needs are met and security and safety are restored. A smaller body of research, and this is what I'm showing at the top, has shown how cumulative changes, such as rising temperatures, rising sea levels, and melting sea ice, have impacted mental health and well-being. And so we know that disruption to important places and landscapes can impact a sense of place and identity and lead to emotional responses of anxiety, grief, anger, helplessness, depression, among others. Cumulative changes have been associated with ecological grief, which you may have heard of, and disruptions of connections to land, culture, relationships, and community ties. And down at the bottom, there's also a lot of interest in the idea that simply knowing about or anticipating the problem of climate change may induce strong emotional, cognitive, and behavioral reactions. So there was a recent study by Hickman and colleagues among 10,000 youth globally that found that over 50% felt sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty. And this is really a growing body of literature and something that we're trying to understand better at the moment, but these reactions are largely considered normative, and they seem to be affecting large proportions of studied populations. Finally, climate change impacts can also be experienced through someone else's experience. So for example, vicarious trauma can occur among friends and family of someone who's been directly impacted by a traumatic event, and of course also among first responders, medical service providers, and others who are involved. Next slide, please. This is a framework that was included in the WHO policy brief on climate change and mental health. And what this framework shows is that there are a range of health, socioeconomic, geographic, demographic, and political factors that actually increase vulnerability to climate change impacts on mental health and well-being. And I want to highlight here that age is listed under demographic factors. Climate change can indirectly impact mental health through exposure to other types of environmental risks, as well as climate change-related displacement, food insecurity, economic insecurity, loss of culture, and poor physical health, among other factors that I've mentioned. Next slide, please. And one thing that I like about this framework is that it highlights that climate change is only one of several factors driving biodiversity loss, along with habitat change and environmental exploitation and pollution. And the field of research investigating links between these things, and specifically biodiversity loss and mental health, is new but growing. There is research evidence that natural environments and green spaces, including biodiverse environments, are beneficial to mental health and well-being. And we also know that worsening habitat conditions can impact mental health and its social determinants. Next slide, please. At the same time, this framework highlights how air pollution can harm mental health and development. So for instance, prenatal air pollution has been associated with cognitive impairments in childhood, and air pollution has been associated with the incidence of a range of mental disorders in adolescence and adulthood, including, for example, depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia. Next slide. Thank you. So where does this leave us? Age is mentioned as a vulnerability factor in the WHO briefing paper framework that I showed you, but you might be wondering how climate change specifically affects the mental health and well-being of infants, children, and youth. Well, the IPCC and others have specifically identified children, adolescents, older adults, and those with underlying health conditions as populations at particular risk of experiencing climate change-related impacts on mental health. Next slide, please. And why is this? On this slide, I'm showing a model by Burrows and Fussell. And this model predicts cumulative environmental exposure by age and birth cohort. And for the purposes of our discussion today, what I want you to take away from this are two things that highlight a tremendous inequity. The first is that younger generations will experience worse health effects from climate change than older generations, due to increased cumulative exposure to climate change and environmental threats over their lifetimes. The second is that infants, children, and youth are particularly vulnerable to the health impacts, including mental health impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. In their lifetime, so this is an example of how climate change is affecting exposure to hazards between generations from a study by Thierry and colleagues. And they predicted that a child born in 2020 would experience 2 to 7 more heat waves than a child born in 1960 in their lifetime. And of course, this inequity is most pronounced in low-income countries, but would be substantially alleviated by keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Next slide, please. This figure is from a powerful article, which I encourage you to read, by a pediatrician. And I'll just share the headline statement with you that said, "The catastrophic effects of climate change on children's health start before birth." And in this paper, they essentially describe how the fingerprint of climate change on future generations of children begins before they are born, as pregnant women are exposed to climate change hazards. And these impacts really continue over development. And we'll hear more about this from my colleagues. Next and final slide, please. Barry and colleagues define the climate change and mental health system as all climate change related geopolitical, ecological, and environmental factors that affect mental health. In this conceptualization, the climate change and mental health system includes interrelationships between harmful actions of governments and industry, the aggravation of social and economic factors that determine mental health, the destruction and upheaval caused by climate change and the pressure that this puts on public resources and systems, including health and social systems, adverse impacts on societal and community functioning, and the loss or limitation of resources to cope and connect with others in this context, all of which, of course, impact mental health and well-being. The unequal impacts of climate change and the ecological crisis on infant, child, and youth mental health and well-being can also be considered using such a systems thinking approach. And clearly, there is urgent work needed to understand and act to address impacts and support strengths and resilience among people within and across these developmental stages. Thank you.
Thank you, Yura, and we'll go straight to Zainab.
Great, thank you, Louise. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So I've been tasked with sharing UNICEF's perspective on the enabling environment at the intersection of climate and ecological crises with mental health. Now, of course, we know the connections between climate change, ecological crises, and our mental health are incredibly intricate. And addressing the challenges at the intersection of these issues requires a holistic and compassionate approach, one that prioritizes the mental health and psychosocial needs of infants, children, adolescents, and their caregivers throughout every phase of climate action, including preparedness, prevention, and response. Now, for many of you, this slide and the theoretical underpinnings presented are not new, and that's because we know what works to advance effective MHPSS. And these are the same proven strategies that we should integrate into our climate response efforts. Investing in comprehensive systems that address diverse mental health needs, whether pre-existing, climate-induced, or otherwise, is critical. And this involves strengthening capacities in health, education, social services, and child protection to create resilient and adaptable and inclusive services that can reach even the most vulnerable children and communities. And the socio-ecological model that you see here as well is a critical theoretical underpinning for effective approaches to MHPSS and climate integration efforts. The thoughtful placement of the child at the center, surrounded by circles of support. These circles represent relationships with family and caregivers, friendships, school environments, and the broader community. And each layer influences the child's inner world, policies and cultural norms for the outermost circle, creating the enabling environment for mental health. And MHPSS programming, including how we engage across stages of climate preparedness, prevention, and response, should embrace this model, understanding the different entry points for care and how relationships and environments shape children's mental health and well-being. And another critical underpinning as part of this discourse on the intersection of climate and mental health is the life course approach and the need to establish a model of care from pre-birth through adulthood, adapting to each developmental stage of the child. And as Lynn will always remind us, often overlooked age groups include infants and early childhood, and also middle childhood, as we're seeing in our own programs. And these age groups require special attention. And the greatest threat facing mothers and infants in these stages is the combined effect of climate and ecological crises. So these crises directly impact the developing brain of an infant and the child, and the mental health of the mother and the caregiver that provide this protective environment for the child. So promoting nurturing care, and I'm sure Lynn will speak to this at length today, in these early stages is critical for long-term resilience. Next slide, please. And so let's get into some common misconceptions about mental health, and Yura touched a little bit on this as well. We often now hear mainstream terms like eco-anxiety, eco-paralysis, ecological grief. All of these have really emerged to describe the mental health impacts of these crises. These terms highlight very real emotions that are experienced by young people, and I've witnessed this firsthand, but they often lack a strong foundation in clinical research. So it's important to recognize that the feelings of fear, worry, and stress and hopelessness in response to climate change and ecological crises are natural. And while they should be taken seriously, they should not be overly pathologized. What we need is a multi-layered approach to MHPSS, which we know works, and apply it to our integration efforts with climate action. This approach really recognizes the vast and often complex needs of young people and considers the various levels of support required. Some really quick examples, just kind of looking at this pyramid on the slide. Oh, wow, already I see a hand. Okay, I won't go through the examples of the layers, but really the main message here is to remember that the mental health impacts related to climate change go beyond eco and anxiety and cover the full continuum of mental health experiences, protective and risk factors, and strengths and vulnerabilities that young people in their communities possess. So really understanding these complexities helps us provide the right support at the right time. Next slide, please. So really moving quickly into the specific considerations or recommendations for implementing MHPSS interventions for infants, children, adolescents, and caregivers. At the individual level, we need to enhance the accessibility, quality, and scale of multisectoral MHPSS. This means providing age-appropriate tools and resources for emotional regulation and stress management, coping strategies, supporting peer-to-peer programs to foster resilience, rolling out interventions and resources to support the mental health of young climate advocates and change makers who are on the front line of these escalating crises. At the caregiver level, we need to prioritize programs that maintain and improve the mental health of parents and caregivers, especially in climate-affected regions. That means supporting their own mental health and well-being and ensuring that their skills are strengthened to recognize signs of distress in children and respond with nurturing care. And also means ensuring tailored approaches to caregivers of children with specific needs, including those with developmental disabilities or pre-existing mental health issues or protection concerns. At the community level, we need to be scaling up MHPSS activities for children and families in schools and communities. This means promoting the mental health and psychosocial well-being of educators, establishing recreational and structured group activities for children, delivering MHPSS preparedness and trainings for first responders, and community-based and community youth-led spaces for dialogue and expression. And finally, at the systems level, we need to integrate mental health and psychosocial well-being into national policies and plans and systems, including nationally determined contributions, early warning and response systems, and more. There was a recent study in The Lancet, which we will plug into the chat, which found an absence of explicit attention to children's mental health in national adaptation policies and climate change, despite it being well documented as a critical need. So this is really unacceptable. And one last thing I will mention is a key missing piece here as well, and Yura spoke to this at length, is the data and research on the impact of climate crisis on mental health, which really needs to be prioritized to help us develop evidence-based and needs-informed solutions for policy advocacy, program design, and implementation at the intersection of mental health and climate change and ecological crises. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zainab. Thank you, Yura. That was a very, very fast carbon neutral helicopter ride we just took with a lot of information crammed into only 14 minutes. Well done. Thank you. So now we're coming out of the helicopter and getting a little bit closer to the children and young people and families whose lives are affected by the climate crisis and the climate and ecological crisis. We have four presenters. We have Dr. Lynn Jones, who will look at the climate ecological crisis from the perspective of the developing child. Andrea Spiridu from UNICEF will take us to Latin America and the Caribbean and introduce us to youth and adolescents affected by the climate and ecological crisis. And after that, we'll take a trip to Bangladesh with Maria Bray and learn how TEDS OMS works with sports and protection, resilience and transformation in the context of climate crisis. And finally, but absolutely not least, Pratit Singh will remind us how important it is to center children and young people in any response related to climate and ecological crisis. So I will hand over to Lynn now. And Lynn, you're muted.
I always forget that bit. Thanks very much, Louise, and for the introduction. And in a way, some of my points already made, I'm glad to say, which is that don't forget infants. That's my number one. Infants and small children seem to get left out even when we're talking about children. So my job in the next 6 minutes is to share some of the impacts of the climate and ecological crises on that age group. We all know the first 1,000 days from conception is so important for later life, and enhancing and protecting, I'm going to say maternal because it usually is the mother, and child physical and mental health at that time is crucial. And so is protecting the child in their early years. UNICEF has come up with what is needed in the nurturing care framework. And what I love about this diagram, apart from the bright colors and it's a circle and easy to read, is that it shows it's not just health, but nutrition, security, opportunities to learn, responsive, loving parenting. This is what a child requires. It's a wraparound approach. If they don't have all of those things, they're not going to develop well. So sadly, in this talk, I'm going to show you what the climate and ecological crisis is doing to those. Next slide, please. So here's some bad news. 559 million children, 23%, are currently exposed to the high heat waves Dura talked about, and that's expected to rise to 2 billion children by 2050. I've listed here the profound effects of heat on pregnancy, and that obviously, as Zainab's already told us, affects the developing brain. After birth, the dehydrated, unwell, overheated mother is going to be stressed, anxious, and much less able to give her baby the protection and attention needed, making the baby even more vulnerable to the direct effects. Now, this is what we have to really think about. A baby has a much bigger surface area, so does a child, compared to their mass, which means the smaller body heats up more quickly, has less capacity to release heat via sweating, can't obviously run around and find water and shade it needs, multiple organs are affected, and it's a really bad situation. And even mild overheating activates the stress system, disrupts sleep, and that has long-term effects into adulthood. So heat, and we're just about to go into a major heat wave here in the UK, has a major negative effect on children. Okay, next slide, please. Well, let's find some water. But unfortunately, access to water is in increasingly short supply. And I think this slide speaks for itself. UNICEF, thank you again, has said that 1 in 3 children are already exposed to water shortages. And in many of the countries I've worked, I witnessed children under 8, 3 to 4-year-olds, even 2-year-olds being sent for water unaccompanied with all the attendant risks of doing so, including more heat exposure, abuse, missing out on education. Next slide, please. Joe has brought up the list of floods and disasters. And yes, you have lots of water and it underlies excessive precipitation, cyclones, hurricanes, underpins all extreme weather events. And the physical effects are obvious and dramatic. I can't discuss them here. The mental ones are less immediately visible, but they're enduring and profound. For example, here's some interesting research. After a major storm in France, 94% of children aged 0 to 5 presented at least one manifestation of acute stress. Note, that's not a pathology, as Zainab has told us, but it's still distressing. And about a third showed developmental regression. But arguably, it's the impact on the carers, either through their absence, through death, which is terrible, or their changed mental state and behavior because they're dealing with a disaster. And in every disaster where I've worked, and I've worked in many, dealing with the mental impacts of loss, both of loved ones, and the normal, losing your normal environment has been the major focus of my work. Stressed, depressed, and grieving parents can become harsh and neglectful parents, and that has a profound impact on the infant and young child. And of course, all of this is compounded by the loss of infrastructure. 1.8 billion people, 23% of the world's population, live in areas directly exposed to what used to be called 1 in 100-year events. They're not 1 in 100 years anymore. 89% of those are in low and mid-income nations. Next slide, please.
Yes, and you have 2 more minutes, Lynn.
Yeah, okay. Vectors. I'm not going to go because I only got 2 minutes, so I'm going to skip a little. Please look at this slide, because we've forgotten that our changing patterns of climate are bringing dengue, malaria, and Zika, other diseases, into areas we've never had to encounter them. And no, they're not just physical illnesses, they are also mental illnesses. Neurological damage, Zika gives you microcephaly. Take a look at the slide when you have time, because I want to come on to air pollution. I know that Zainab's already mentioned it, so has Dura, but it's every one of us in this room, and most people I know, are breathing air that exceeds WHO guidelines and limits. I've listed for you here, again, take time to read the slide, the profound mental health consequences. And I'm quoting the BMJ editorial: accumulating evidence shows that air pollution, systemic inflammation, oxidative stress, adverse effects on the nervous system, mental and reproductive health. Young children Pregnant women are especially susceptible. So my final, now I've got 2 slides, I hope you'll let me see them, is this is what we're doing to the nurturing care framework. We are wrecking it and we are causing toxic stress. That's why the climate crisis and the ecological crisis have to be looked at as adverse childhood events. And if you see them as ACEs, then you begin to understand the long-term negative impacts that this has on a child's health. Never mind the fact they've got to deal with repeated stresses right through their life. Just one of these early in their life disrupting this framework, toxic stress, adverse child events, they will be profoundly affected in their mental health. So my last slide is I want to say, what can we do? Zainab's given us frameworks, but we've got to go and ask families, parents and children what they're already doing, what threats they're facing, and how are they coping, and what do they know? When we found that out, through conversation, through focus groups, through discussion, we then have to help them with resilience. I and my husband are about to embark on that in Guatemala, doing the qualitative assessment before we do interventions to educate them on how to cope directly in their community with heat exposure, with water loss. It's got to be done at this micro level if it's going to be effective at the macro level, which is also needed. And I'm going to stop there. Ask me questions if you have more. Apologies for the speed. I don't know how to cover this topic in 6 minutes. Sorry.
Thank you, Lynn. You did very well, only 40 seconds past, so that's awesome. So we are moving on to Andrea.
Thank you, Liz. And thanks everyone for joining this very important topic. And following what Lynn has already shared, just to give a bit more of information on the stats that we have and data that we have about children and adolescents. These are all from a report that UNICEF carried out in 2021 about the impact of climate change and ecological crisis on children and adolescents. And what has already mentioned, and I think we need to continue highlighting, is that its effects exacerbating the barriers to access and availability of drinking water, health, housing, water supply, and sanitation. And in our region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, we've seen an increased forced migration due to all these factors. And it also exacerbates the impact on people and groups in a situation of vulnerability, especially children, young people, women, but also indigenous people, people with disabilities, riverine communities, and other low-income groups, which are unfortunately disproportionately affected and disadvantaged due to pre-existing inequalities and inequities. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we have been working very closely. Next slide, please. We've been working very closely with youth advocates, and in 2022, we developed the Youth Network for Mental Health. We started with a small group of 20 young people from 8 countries, and we worked together with our country officers to have them participate in different activities like capacity building, including the, as I've heard my friends, intervention in advocacy and communication, skill development, and also in providing them with all the information and tools that we need to become really advocates for mental health rights of children and adolescents. And during this period from 2022 up to today, they have contributed in different UNICEF's initiatives, like, for example, the participation in plenaries and workshops in the Global Mental Health Summit in Argentina, or the youth-led Spotify mental health podcast adaptation and launch in 8 countries, which just happened a couple of weeks ago. Next slide, please. The purpose of the Youth Network was actually to be able to develop their skills, social and emotional skills, but also we wanted them to help us create relevant content on mental health and psychosocial support, promoting advocacy and communication campaigns, and to promote intergenerational dialogue and advocacy on mental health. And through all these conversations and discussions we've had with them, the issue of climate change and ecological crisis keeps coming up as an important factor and dimension to child and adolescent mental health. Next slide, please. So one of the things that was developed as a meaningful platform where youth could actually talk about mental health was this card game called Collective Minds, which was developed in order to create spaces for dialogue on mental health and on the different factors that impact mental health. The game currently is available for the print and play version, which you can find on the www.colectivamente.org and learn more about how to play. But the theme, as you can see also from the pictures, the theme that was chosen by the youth was very linked to nature and to the indigenous wisdom that the indigenous populations of Latin America and the Caribbean have to offer. And I really invite you to visit the webpage and learn more about the game. Next slide, please. In 2024, UNICEF and Let's Unpack It developed the Child and Youth Mental Health Focal Point Network, which is comprised by youth from 17 Caribbean countries. And this was developed to address the climate change and mental health crisis by young people. And they work together to develop a resource package and document what are the needs for resources for young people. The resource is called the Young Caribbean Minds, Mental Health and Wellbeing Technology Enhanced, which you can also find into the youngcaribbeanminds.com webpage. In this webpage, they present tools that young people can use in order to learn more about how they can advocate and make a difference on mental health and climate change in their own communities, how they can influence policymakers and decision makers in their own countries. Next slide, please. And a research study has asserted that the Caribbean children and youth are more likely to be victims of psychological distress due to climate-related events such as natural disasters. And UNICEF for the Eastern Caribbean area executed a study in 2022, which was titled Participatory Research on Climate Change and Other Shocks on the Mental Health and Psychosocial Wellbeing of Adolescents and Youth in the Eastern Caribbean area. In this study, they revealed the need to develop more educational material for children and youth and further in-depth research. And as a result, the UReport platform, which is a platform that UNICEF uses to collect information and share information back with youth, the survey was executed through this platform in 2023 in collaboration with the Pan American Health Organization. This survey revealed that of the 1,370 young people that were surveyed in the Eastern Caribbean, 80% reported that they were thinking about how climate impacts their health, and almost 70% called for large-scale efforts to tackle the effects of climate change on health. And with this, I just wanted to sum it up to the importance to give a platform and space for youth to express how they think and how they feel, but also to provide them with the advocacy tools, with the information and the needed platforms where they can actually advocate and make a difference in their countries, in their communities, influencing important policies in each country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Just a quick reminder, because I've seen people raising their hands, please put any questions you may have in the Q&A or comments, then we can pick up on it later. And then I will leave the word to Maria Bray.
Hello, everyone. So I'm very happy to be here with you and to have the opportunity to share an example of a MHPSS project developed in Bangladesh by Terre des Hommes to support the well-being and resilience of children and youth affected by climate crisis and displacement, using this innovative approach, sports for protection and empowerment. So this is a project that is supported by the Olympic Refuge Foundation and which involves 2 local organizations implementing activities. Breaking the Silence is one and Solidarity is the other. Next slide. So Bangladesh is one of the world's most vulnerable nations to climate crisis due to its low-lying geography, making it prone to severe flooding, cyclones, and rising sea levels. Additionally, its large population and reliance on agriculture exacerbate the impact of extreme weather events, threatening food security and livelihood, which affect actually more than 19 million Bangladeshi children. So those continuous flooding and natural disaster also implies that a large part of the population, about 41% actually, has to migrate, and displacement is also exacerbating risk to children and their families. So the project I will present is implemented actually in 2 locations. We can see here on the map. One is in the northwest Bangladesh, which is the province of Kurigram, which is very remote and a rural area, and is one of the most affected districts in terms of the climate crisis consequences, as it's surrounded by 3 major rivers. And it's also Kurigram is actually also known as one of the districts having the highest rate of child marriage in Asia. 60% of girls are married before the age of 18. Next slide. So another location, so you can see here Kurigram on the left, and another location actually where the project works is in Dhaka, the capital city, and more specifically in the slums, where actually most of the climate crisis affected population moves. Today, Dhaka is exploding with climate migrants, as nearly 500,000 people move to the capital city every year. So actually, all those children living in Dhaka slums are also at greater risk of violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Next slide. So here you can see an attempt of analysis that was done at the design of this project, trying to better understand the link between the climate crisis and its consequences in terms of environment, in terms of family assets, displacement, and potential risk for children and youth in terms of child protection and well-being. Vulnerabilities in terms of livelihood created situation, additional risk with dropping out of school, forced marriage, child labor, GBV, which all impact negatively children's well-being. And this in turn increased the vulnerability and risks and ends up being a kind of spiral in which children and families become less and less resilient to hazards and disaster. Next slide. So since the beginning of this project, we had multiple spaces to hear voices of children and youth on the consequences they experience of the climate crisis. And in terms of their well-being, we've gathered here some of the main challenges they face linked with the 5 well-being pillars we use in Terre des Hommes. And we can see that children feel unsafe, threatened in their physical and emotional stability, feel a loss of control, having no access to information and limited access to basic needs. They feel disconnected, and this is mainly linked with the continuous displacement they are experiencing. For example, in one of the villages where we work, the school have been moved inland, further away from the river, 3 times in the last 4 years. And each time, children fear to lose their friends and a routine, and some family decide to move for good. They also feel there is not much space for their voice and feelings and opinion to be heard, and less opportunities for actually taking any action to improve their situation and mitigate impact of the ongoing climate crisis. And of course, in that situation, poor hope for the future. Next slide. So this project targets around 10,000 children, mostly in Kurigram. The project goal is actually to improve the inclusion and empowerment of vulnerable adolescents and youth displaced because of climate crisis. And when we speak about empowerment, we speak, of course, of trying to support children and youth to have the power to act, to address some of the consequences of the climate crisis, but also to prevent further risks. But also, which is a prerequisite, is to support the power within, right? To children and youth who needs to be supported to actually cope, adapt, and transform in face of adversity in which they live in, and help gain a sense of control and hope for the future. Next slide. So the theory of change and strategy is used to support children and youth and communities. So next. Is actually based on 3 different pathways. We actually believe that if children have access to information using a do no harm and resilience-based approach, if we support them and strengthen life skills, and then if we initiate spaces in which they can actually have leadership opportunity, then they can start bringing positive change to their life and their communities. Next. So in terms of approach and tools that we've been using, the first one is a climate crisis resilience-based information sharing protocol. So the curriculum integrates a resilience-based approach, which comes from an existing toolkit that you can see here. This resource is a concrete toolkit that provides a methodology to inform children about how climate change can affect violence against children, but also to explore children's reaction, feeling, and understanding, and reinforce children's well-being and psychosocial resilience by supporting children formulate recommendation. It's also it has been proven in the project that it's really supporting children to really ignite a sense of responsibility and collective action. Next. In order to support life skills, we've been using, as I mentioned, sports for protection, which is really used to enhance safety and well-being, supporting gender and social inclusion by strengthening life skills and fostering connection. And here again, both in Dakar and Kurigram, feedback we received were really mentioning the effectiveness of this approach to support the development of essential life skills, such as teamwork, leadership, communication, and responsibility. And lastly, in terms of leadership opportunities, we also use a strategy, which is a participative action research with youth, really supporting them to identify and address collectively challenges they are experiencing. Next slide. So to finish this presentation, and even if we have not yet done a formal evaluation as the project's still ongoing, I'm sharing here with you some of the feedback we've collected as per the changes that children and youth feel is taking place thanks to this project. And we can see that children are experiencing more access to information, feel more in control, developing a sense of calming, developing meaningful role and positive identities who help them feel empowered, and increase their social network, peer relationship, and also help them cope with stress, fear, anxiety, and grief. But also actually breaking, and this is really thanks to sports, I believe, breaking some of the existing bias and stereotype linked with positive gender norms that help them really feel also for the girls involved and being leading on changes that they want to see in their communities. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Maria. And then we give the word to Pratit.
Thank you so much, Louise, and thank you, Maria, for that presentation. I would just begin as to, talking about my experiences as a child rights activist and how I, as a young person, being involved in discussions around climate change, feel about the discussions that go around in terms of involving children in decisions and that concern their well-being as guaranteed by the Committee on the Rights of Child. And so in the current discussions around that involve children and young people on the talk about climate change, I find that there are three things which are often not acknowledged or are generally missing. First of them is, of course, child friendliness. Often when children and young people are involved in discussions on climate change, there's a certain lack of effort towards ensuring that whatever terms and contexts that are used while describing climate change are sort of understood well by children and young people, which are in the group context. Secondly, and recalling what Zainab had presented initially as a part of this program, was that the fact that that factors like eco-anxiety are very real feelings is often also not acknowledged by when children and young people are involved in discussions around climate crisis. And lastly, meaningfulness is something which is often also missing when children are involved with adults or organizations or across the world, even with organizations like the United Nations, in terms of talking about climate change. Now, how are these elements missing? When we look at, of course, child friendliness is something that tends to lose its course when sort of adults start talking to children, because often in terms of talking about climate, they tend to use heavy terms loaded in terms of meanings and loaded in terms of context, which are often not recognized by children. And that's where it leads to the lack of meaningfulness, right? Because when children, young people involved in discussions cannot understand and comprehend well the meanings of things that are involved in around climate change, that's where it leads to a feeling of confusion. It leads to a feeling of sort of illusionment of what the discussion is about. And that leads me to describing the second problem, which is that of meaningfulness, which is that often it is very tokenistic when children and young people are involved in discussions around climate change, whereas it should not be, as the Convention on the Rights of Child guarantees every child to be a participant in every discussion that concerns their well-being. And so in the term of meaningfulness as well, often it is very easy for stakeholders to portray climate change within a doomsday image, which often provokes a reaction of eco-anxiety for children. And this often is unacknowledged because this is something that not much thought has been given to. And that drives me to sort of look at the toolkit which Maria just talked about, developed with Terrazome, and I can talk about it because I was one of the, I was in a group of children and young people who this toolkit was used for to engage in a meaningful discussion around climate change. And I like this toolkit and encourage such toolkits as such in terms of engaging with children, because it ensures that whenever there's a discussion with children and young people, it is meaningful to the most. It talks about building a trust with children and young people and adults when talking about something like climate change. Because we also need to realize that especially when talking to children and young people, their experience with something like climate change, their experience with something like violence faced in context of climate change can be very personal to them. And so the first and foremost thing, which is very important when engaging children and young people, is to giving importance to what they feel, giving importance to building trust with them so that they can talk freely about their experiences, their imagination, and their hopes with what the climate crisis holds and in terms of the future. Secondly, it also talks about building capacity with children, which is that, when talking to children and young people about the climate crisis, it's important that we don't just project the future doomsday image, but also that, that we take children and young people's agency into account, which is that to make sure that, to inform them about what their rights are in context of climate change, to inform them about what children and young people can do in terms of climate change. And that becomes super important, right? Because that also averts and addresses a part of eco-anxiety, but adds to the meaningfulness as well of the discussions of involving children and young people. And lastly, highlighting as to why this is important. It's because when talking to children and young people in context of climate change, we forget that children and young people have the agency to sort of, exercise their rights, demand for their rights, and look out for solutions. And so another factor that this toolkit brought together was that, it signposted children and young people towards resources which they can head to for looking for what they can do about climate change. How can they sort of address this factor of eco-anxiety that springs so vividly when engaging in discussions around climate change. And so very shortly, you'll see a video around around how children and young people can be engaged. And this video was a part of this toolkit, which was developed by a group of children and young people, including myself, as a part of the COVID-19 initiative. And I'd just like to conclude with that video. If we could have that video, please.
Yes. And we're starting sort of in the middle for time reasons, but we will post the full link.
Najat Mala Mjid is the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against.
I don't know if it's just me, but we can't hear them.
Yeah, we lost the sound.
Key axis of change through investment in education, child-friendly policies, programs, and actions. Everyone has a role to play. Work together like an orchestra to protect children, local, international, and religious communities, businesses, non-profit organizations, governments, and United Nations.
We connect now. We have the right to learn and be informed, share information with your peers and across all generations. We have the right to be heard, build confidence to express ourselves, and listen to the voices of children who face violence and climate change. We have the right to peacefully join others in action. Don't stand alone. Connect with climate groups and programs.
Children have the right to a safe and healthy environment free from violence.
Thank you. And this was the video we developed together with the UNSRSG and of course the COVID-19 initiative. And so the idea is to make sure that whenever when stakeholders engage in discussions with children and young people, to involve their voices, but also to encourage their involvement and to promote a knowledge of their own rights, and not just promoting an image of climate change, which very naturally provokes eco-anxiety, and to be mindful when talking about programming in terms of climate change. And that's something that I'd like to echo through this platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pratit. We will link to the full version of the film, and it's really worth watching the whole 4 minutes. You only got a minute and a half. We have a little bit less than the promised 10 minutes for questions, and Marie has been monitoring the Q&A as we've been speaking. Do we have something? Otherwise, I do.
We have a couple of questions that have been addressed, and I invite you to put it, now that we're at the end, you can put your question also in the regular chat if you can't find the Q&A chat. So we have a number of people here that are quite knowledgeable, and we're happy to respond to anything, but why don't you start, Louise?
Okay, so when we were planning this, we had a bit of a conversation about whether we should only talk about climate change or whether we should talk about climate change and ecological crisis. And Yura, you touched upon biodiversity loss, which is part of the ecological crisis. So could we maybe put a few more words to why we insist on talking about both climate change and ecological crisis? Yura, would you maybe like to say something?
Sure, Lynn also, or yeah, Lynn, if you want to start, and then I can follow up if there are
Well,
any.
I'll just give you a simple example coming out now. Plastic. There's more plastic on the planet than there are people in terms of biomass, and we're every day getting new revelations of the damage and the insidiousness of microplastics in our blood, in our brains. This is an ecological disaster, and it's not related, it's certainly related to fossil fuels, but it's not related to a changing climate. They are interlinked but separate problems that have to be addressed together. You can't leave out, as Yura eloquently said, the destruction of nature, but I just wanted to flag an obvious example. Yura, you can expand on that, please.
No, I think that was perfectly said, Lynn. I mean, I completely agree. These are really inextricable problems and require reckoning with the fact that we're part of a much larger system on this planet, and we've been living for a long time as if we're not. And to address climate change, we also have to address these other problems. And to provide just another concrete example for people, climate change related air pollution is directly driven by greenhouse gas emissions, right? So greenhouse gas emissions are driving climate change, but they're also literally polluting the air that we breathe, impacting all kinds of adversely impacting all kinds of health outcomes, including mental health outcomes that Lynn mentioned. So I won't detail those, but so that's a very, very clear direct impact. But in short, we're part of a much larger system on this planet.
Thank you.
Well, I don't see any new questions in the chat boxes, so I'm just going to follow up on a curiosity that I have. That could be maybe to Andrea or Pratit. I'm curious of what you have seen be the most powerful or useful when it comes to peer support approaches. Is that something that happens naturally, or is it something that you've seen needs kind of a nudge or a support in the context that you have been? You are.
Maybe Pratit, you want to start, and I can continue.
Sure. So, I mean, just talking in terms of, my own experience is that, I've seen it happen both naturally as well as nudge. Of course, nudge in terms of, building intergenerational partnerships is super helpful most of the times, because it is often that, civil society organizations and NGOs that bring together children, young people, and this bringing together sort of fosters a community, an intergenerational community, which sort of builds into a peer support. And I sort of remember this because, an initiative which has just concluded, the COVID-19 initiative, did something very, very similarly, wherein, it brought together children, young people during the pandemic to talk about how their experiences are. And so that bringing together built into, having having a peer support group wherein, children and young people could talk about how they feel about different aspects of the pandemic. But then it grew into, something like climate change. And then we ultimately ended up contributing to the toolkit that I mentioned. And so, of course, NGOs and CSOs play a huge role in bringing together and fostering this sort of intergenerational support and intergenerational peer groups.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that similarly to what Pratik was saying, in our region, we've seen that when you bring together peers of similar age and similar interests, in our case, in the youth network, all of our youth had some motivation to be advocates for mental health. Some had their own lived experience, and some had overcome many challenges to access services for mental health. So for them, becoming advocates immediately became such an important value and mission for their life. So we've seen that they've been not only supporting each other, so created really very amazing bonds within the same network, but they have gone to use the information and the skills they've learned to support others in their own communities. And this has grown in an exponential way to have networks in Paraguay, in Argentina, in Colombia, them using the tools that we provided to them to adapt them and support other people in their community that are also challenging with the same barriers. And in terms of discussions around climate change, they always bring up this issue that our mental health and well-being is directly linked to climate change and ecological crisis. And they keep up, finding very creative and innovative ways of addressing this issue, which is also very inspiring to us, the older generation. We are really learning from them. So yeah, it has been such a beautiful journey. And I was just receiving a message from one of our youth advocates in Colombia, which she has been hired as a junior staff in the Colombian UNICEF office. And she's leading one of the videos talking about the importance of mental health and addressing mental health issues among children and caregivers in Colombia. So it's so heartwarming to see them grow and to see them becoming really agents of positive change in their communities. Thank you.
Thank you. And on that positive note, I will let Marie wrap up.
Yes, so we're at 3 minutes past time, so we want to release you. Thank you so much for joining all of our panelists and all of our participants. As put in the chat, the link to the recording and the whole presentation, you can maybe go to the next one. List of resources is long, so you will have access to all of the ones that are there. And we just encourage you to keep your eye out for the next Wednesday webinar for Wellbeing. It's going to be on MHPSS in child protection and education in crisis settings, and it's happening in September. So there's a bit of a break now over the summer. And we thank you all so much for joining, and have a lovely day, evening, night, wherever you are.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.